Welcome to the NewSpace India podcast, a bi-weekly talk show that exclusively captures insightful conversations with people contributing to advancement of space activities in India. The NewSpace India podcast is pleased to announce our association with Dassault Systems, a global leader in providing business and people with collaborative virtual environments to imagine sustainable innovations. Dassault Systems solutions support startups, small and medium-sized enterprises, and original equipment manufacturers in developing disruptive solutions for space launches and satellite propulsion. Recently, a supply chain digitization study with Dassault Systems was conducted to provide a foundational understanding of the supplier landscape in the Indian space ecosystem. Please use the link in the description to download the public white paper of the results of this study, which will also give you a perspective on how ready Indian suppliers are to enter the global space market. Hi, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the NewSpace India podcast. And we're very lucky to have here Ambassador Sood with us, probably one of the only people I know in India who can talk about the intersection between space and diplomacy when it comes to the Indian context. So welcome to the episode, Ambassador Sood.
Thank you, Narayan. I'm happy to join you.
As an introduction, we would love to know a little bit about your career, what got you into this context of diplomacy, and then later on, what was your connection with space?
Although by education I did my master's in theoretical physics, but then somehow I went and joined the Foreign Service way back in 1976. And normally you wouldn't expect somebody from the Foreign Service to be talking about outer space related issues, but then it just so happened that I spent a large part of my career dealing with regional and international and national security related issues. I was posted in Geneva at the Conference on Disarmament first in 1986 as first secretary. And then I went back there in 2000 as the ambassador, dealing specifically with arms control, disarmament, and security-related issues. Now, I think perhaps some of your listeners might recall that there is an agenda item in the Conference on Disarmament called Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. Now, this item was actually introduced on the agenda of the CD in Geneva way back in 1982 for the first time. 1983 was when President Reagan gave his famous SDI speech, space, the defense initiative, where he talked of rendering nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. I mean, it was a far-reaching kind of a thing. So, from about 1984-85 onwards, we have had an ad hoc committee to discuss the issue of prevention of an arms race in outer space. And that was my first introduction to the subject. And then subsequently, I was in Delhi through the 1990s, almost for a decade or so, a period that coincided with the end of the Cold War. And the development, and I set up the Disarmament and International Security Affairs Division in the Ministry of External Affairs. Among the issues that I was also looking at very closely was the issue of dual-use technologies, because by this time, we had seen the emergence of a number of ad hoc export control regimes. Now, today we are members of many of these. We are members of the MTCR, Missile Technology Control Regime, or the Australia Group, or the Wassenaar Arrangement on dual-use technologies and munitions. We adhere to the guidelines of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. But way back in the 1990s, we were a strong critic of many of these export control regimes because these regimes targeted our domestic programs. And I think that it is important to recall how our positions on these regimes evolved. and I was very intimately involved. In that process, I interacted extremely closely both with the Department of Space as well as with the Department of Atomic Energy and the DRDO. So that was again part of what drew me into this particular area of security related issues. And that is how I continued to deepen my interest. And as the area has grown in importance for India, and as our positions have evolved, so has, I guess, my personal engagement and involvement, although I left government some years ago. But the idea of looking at these technologies, and today you find this notion of dual use technologies or dual use research of concern, DURC as it is commonly called and referred to, in so many other areas. I mean, biotech is a case in point with which we are now increasingly familiar with in this age of COVID-19. So, how do we deal with this? AI, cyber, space, there is an interlinkage among all of these areas. And because they are seen as having serious security related dimensions, while they also have enormous number of civilian applications.
Right. Thank you very much for that insightful introduction as such. So I wanted to learn from you, what was the situation back then, when you started tackling the issues related to outer space, both from an Indian standpoint, from an international standpoint. Where were the convergences in ideas and where were the divergences that you saw from your context?
Well, at that time in the 1980s, as I mentioned, the immediate provocation for the inscription of this item on the agenda of the Conference on Disarmament was developments in the United States. And so naturally, there was a strong interest in the international community taking this up in the CD as an arms control disarmament issue. Remember, way back in 1959, there had already been set up the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in Vienna, which had two subcommittees, one a technical subcommittee and a legal subcommittee. And however, they looked at it more from the point of view of civilian applications and not from the security related point of view. So when the Conference on Disarmament started looking at it, it started looking at it from the security dimension point of view, because by the 1980s, it was quite clear that while there had been a certain architecture of space law that had come into being, and here I am talking of, perhaps your listeners would be familiar with the fact that there is an outer space treaty that was negotiated in 1967. This was followed by the Liability Convention in 1972. We have had the Rescue Convention, which was done even earlier because, the first beginnings. I mean, today we are looking at the 60th anniversary of the first manned space flight, which took place on 12th of April 1961, Yuri Gagarin. And so immediately thereafter, there was an interest in looking at the rescue of an astronaut or things like that. There was the Liability Convention. Then there was a registration convention as the first satellites started, more and more satellites were launched, including for surveillance and space monitoring and early warning of nuclear launches, missile launches, and things like that. The Moon Treaty was probably the last of these that was negotiated, and that happened in 1984. So thereafter, the space arena has actually not seen any negotiation. What we saw instead was attempts to curb or to control technology proliferation. The MTCR, which was set up in 1987, is a case in point, the Missile Technology Control Regime. And as you know, the MTCR, when it was first set up, it had a very small, restrictive list of technologies. Over a period of time, that restrictive list of technologies was expanded to cover dual-use technologies. So, it became more and more restrictive, as it were. Now, so as a result, what we saw happening was that there was an increasingly contentious debate because the US was looking at space as a war-fighting domain. However, the key difference here is that at that point in time, a lot of space activity was the domain of governments. I mean, I remember looking at some figures that something like, US and Russia during the Cold War accounted for something like 90% of all space launches. And today, that situation is different. I mean, today you've got the private sector involved in it hugely. Today, you've got the situation has changed so dramatically that you've got companies like SpaceX and you've got companies like Amazon's and you've got OneWeb and today the number of launches that are being done, the number of satellites that are out there orbiting, I mean, it has changed completely. So this is the transformation that has taken place. And this is something that is going to continue. We ourselves are seeing the fact that you have a podcast of the kind that you have, which is so assiduously followed by people, not just in India, but outside, who follow developments in this particular field, indicates the direction in which we ourselves are moving. The same is true with regard to the development of counter space capabilities. And yet, at the same time, what we find is that the mechanisms for developing any kind of arms control in these areas to ensure security of space-based assets has remained frozen and hasn't moved very far. And I think that, to me, is a fundamental challenge because how do we deal with this?
When you bring up this whole MTCR guidelines and how it was framed and all of this, the whole idea of MTCR, is it reasonable to say that it was a conception to keep countries like India and Soviet Union back then, possibly Russia, out of the possibility of importing technologies? Is it reasonable to say that, or is it reasonable to say that it was more generic and US wanted to keep out any other country as well? Because at that point of time, possibly India was building bigger rockets, the PSLV was on the stage, and possibly liquid propulsion was coming up, and there's a lot of new technologies that were needed to scale up, and perhaps a lot of them also dependent on importing of certain sensors or actuators or other systems that were coming from France or US or other places. So, what is your perception of the background through which MTCR was framed, viewing from a diplomat's kind of perspective?
Oh, MTCR was, in a sense, we launched while our space program, your listeners are familiar with the development of ISRO, and you had some excellent podcasts earlier talking about the early years of ISRO, Dr. Satish Dhawan's contribution, and the shaping of ISRO culture and all of that. But the direction from which I was coming to it was the security dimension. And we had announced our policy decision setting out the Integrated Guided Missile Development Program by the DRDO in 1984 or 85, if I remember right. The almost quickly thereafter, very quickly thereafter, you had a meeting, and this was between largely among Western countries, led by the United States. It involved, if I remember right, 7 countries. It included France and others, and uh, and that is how they came together to set up a missile technology control regime, because proliferation was seen as a major security threat. Now, the Soviet Union was not part of the MTCR, although I must tell your listeners that when the Nuclear Suppliers Group was set up a decade earlier, it was after the immediate provocation of that was the Indian peaceful nuclear explosion in 1974. And at that time, Soviet Union was a founding member of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. So in fact, in a sense, there was a convergence of interests. However, when there was a convergence of interests in terms of controlling proliferation of sensitive technologies, because even the Soviet Union did not want to see dual use technologies proliferate to its allies. However, by the time the MTCR came into being in 1987, formally speaking, the US had changed its perception in terms of its desire for using space for military or strategic applications. And so the Soviet Union was also a target of not permitting any sensitive technologies from Western countries to leak to Soviet Union or its allies. This is not so unusual, because way back in the 1950s, the first of the dual use technology control regimes was established. It was called the COCOM. COCOM stood for Coordinating Committee. Coordinating committee that was set up was a coordinating committee of largely Western countries to ensure that sensitive technologies did not leak into the communist world, to either say East Germany or Hungary, Poland, etc., etc. It is this particular COCOM which was then wound up after the end of the Cold War and reconfigured into the Wassenaar arrangement as the export control regime for dual use technologies across the board and munitions. So it has a munitions list, armaments, and that kind of thing, and the dual use technologies associated with it. A fourth regime that had been set up just for the sake of completion of the picture was also set up in the mid 1980s, and this was the Australia Group. This dealt with the technologies, equipment, and products dealing which had application and into chemical weapons and biological weapons. So, as part of my responsibilities in the Ministry of External Affairs for nearly a decade, I was very carefully looking at the evolution of these regimes. And because we were seen as outsiders, as it were, and it began with the nuclear tests of 1974. And then, of course, we had not signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We were one of the few countries that remained steadfastly opposed to it. And by this time, we had developed a certain capability with regard to space launches, and we had also launched our integrated guided missile development program. Work on the Prithvi. Prithvi had been tested, and Agni was being worked on. So there was naturally a sense among our scientific community that these regimes were designed to prevent us from developing our indigenously grown technological base in some of these advanced technologies. And then once we tested nuclear weapons in 1998, and we started also looking at the need that these technologies should not leak out of India. So gradually we started putting in export controls ourselves on these technologies. We engaged in a series of very intensive diplomatic dialogues, particularly with the United States, and eventually then got the US to support us in the 2008 waiver of the nuclear suppliers group that enabled civilian nuclear cooperation between India and a number of other countries, which then developed a certain degree of confidence. And then from 2010-11 onwards, we started engaging with these export control regimes. And then during the previous decade, we became members of the Australia Group, the Wassenaar Arrangement, and the MTCR. So it's been a long process of evolution as our capabilities evolved, as our engagements evolved, and as our perceptions evolved. And I dare say, as the perceptions of the world about India also changed. It's a long answer, but I mean, we were really covering a historical period running across decades, and particularly the change of thinking that was needed to bring about this shift.
One of the aspects here that I wanted to you to elaborate is what are the aspects that really come under the purview of a diplomat when it comes to space, right? Because the question is, all the things that you talked about was more about making sure that India is not left out in certain ways, or making sure that the international rule making and treaties and laws favor or are inclusive of Indian growth and Indian interests and so on. But then there are other aspects such as it could be using diplomacy as a tool for cooperation, like what the Soviet Union did with flying Rakesh Sharma onto the space station and then bringing him back. And it could be other such ways, and only now you see some of these regional neighborhood policy with space, and the SARC related satellite, and a few other things like that evolve at this point of time. Now, given that we've had space capabilities for quite a large number of time already, how integrated was space as a part of the Indian diplomatic corps when it comes to using space as an instrument of cooperation, or some sort of a inter-country relationship building, in your memory, in this sense?
With the Department of Atomic Energy, we have had a fairly close relationship because the Department of Atomic Energy came under sanctions beginning in 1974. And, we couldn't get fuel for Tarapur. The Americans cut off nuclear fuel for Tarapur. We had to then look for fuel outside, and eventually in 1983 or 84, the French agreed, and the French also managed to get the agreement of the US, and the French became our suppliers for the low enriched uranium for Tarapur. Now, the Department of Space, we had not had that much of dealings in the Ministry of External Affairs with the Department of Space. But I think what happened was that the wake up call came in 1992 when the Department of Space got sanctioned by the United States. This was with regard to the cryogenic engine deal that ISRO had signed with Glavcosmos. Now, both Glavcosmos and ISRO were sanctioned, which meant that ISRO, which had always had a fairly robust international cooperation network, particularly with countries like France and others, suddenly found itself cut out from a number of its traditional cooperation networks, and it impacted a lot of ISRO's procurements of sensitive components, technologies, materials, etc., which now got labeled as sensitive because we were under sanctions. Now, mind you, these sanctions are unilateral sanctions imposed by the United States. It is not as if These sanctions were imposed by the US. But then the way US, this is what you would call an extraterritorial application of US law. So let's say if the French continued their dealings with ISRO, then the US law is that since US companies were barred from dealing with India, if there was a French company that dealt with India in the same areas, that French company would be barred from any business with the US and their assets could be confiscated by the US. Now, since the US is a major partner for, let's say, I'm using France as an example, but it could be any other, the French company would obviously hesitate to engage with India. But this is because of the power of the overwhelming economic clout of the United States. I mean, it is not as if France has sanctioned us. France did not sanction us on the Glove Cosmos ISRO deal of the cryogenic, but it had a negative impact on ISRO's capabilities, which still required a certain amount of procurement from abroad. And so then came the issue of how do we rectify this situation. In fact, the situation then became much worse with 1998 nuclear tests, because then they came under even heavier sanctions and a hell of a lot of ISRO itself as an entity. It was not just one program, but the whole thing that came under sanctions. So one of the first things that we did when we opened up negotiations with the United States post the nuclear tests was to show them that ISRO was not involved, and we had to make it very clear to them that ISRO was a civilian entity. It was not involved in making missiles. There were no leakages of technology from ISRO to DRDO. The missile making units came under DRDO. It was not as if ISRO was producing, propellants to be for our missile program and things like that. And we were then able to get them to lift the sanctions on ISRO by, I think, if I remember right, the first relaxation of these sanctions started taking place in February of 2000 after about 18 months of talks. And then gradually we were able to get all these sanctions lifted by about 2003 or thereabouts, when we signed the next steps in strategic partnership with the United States. So that's how the engagement between Department of Space and the Disarmament and International Security Affairs Division began, in terms of, because they suddenly said, well, who do we go to? Now, before that, they didn't think that there was anybody in the Ministry of External Affairs who was tracking these things or who was following them or who was looking at the evolution of US and international law in these areas. The second aspect where we worked together with ISRO was when ISRO also realized that we could play a role in promoting international cooperation. So, ISRO had bid to set up the Regional Center for Space Science and Technology Education in India. It was a UN related entity, and they wanted to set up something for Asia Pacific. And ISRO had bid for it, and China was also very keen that they should be hosting it. So, I still remember this was during the time of Dr. Kasturi Rangan, and he was chairman of ISRO and secretary of space. He sort of told us about it, and he said that, look, we think that it would be a great feather in our cap if we could be the ones to get the international community to agree to have this here. Now, because of the fact that we had these other sanctions and other issues pertaining to hanging over us, so it became a diplomatic challenge that we took on. And I still remember at the last meeting that we had, this was sometime in the 1990s, towards the second half of 1990s, the last negotiating round that we had in Delhi. The meeting was taking place in Vigyan Bhavan. The negotiations were continuing. We had all the countries of the Asia Pacific region represented. And eventually, the idea in these things is not to be able to bring it to a vote, but to actually get a decision, because if there is a contest, then, one side eventually sees the writing on the wall and withdraws. And Dr. Kasturi Rangan was sitting in his office waiting to hear what was happening. He was, the Department of Space office was in Loknayak Bhavan in Delhi, near Khan Market. And we were at Vigyan Bhavan. This was before mobile phones and all of that came into common use. So I think it was close to midnight when I finally went back and said the Chinese have withdrawn. And he said that only with MEA's help could we have achieved this. We, on our own, we would never have been able to, because we pulled out a lot of diplomatic stops with the number of small countries in Asia Pacific and so on. And so we ended up hosting this. And then the Chinese got so angry a few years later. They set up almost a parallel outfit, but it didn't have the same, let us say, the same UN stamp. The UN center, which we set up, which is now located in Dehradun, as your listeners probably know. So this is how, a mutual trust and a respect for each other's capabilities grows. And I do think that in today's age, it is extremely important for our departments like ISRO, Department of Space, or Department of Atomic Energy. Or, for example, subsequently I became closely involved because when I was ambassador in Geneva, that was, I told you I went there in 2000 dealing with arms control disarmament issues. That is the time when we were also negotiating a verification protocol for the Biological Weapons Convention. And so I was very closely involved with the Department of Biotechnology in terms of looking at, and precisely the areas we were looking at were at that time, CRISPR and Cas9 had not even come into existence. But there was all, of course, the DNA had been decoded. The first human genome sequencing exercises by Craig Venter were being undertaken. And there was already a glimmer that this technology could change the way biological weapons could be designed. And at the same time, it was also clear that this technology of gene synthesis and synthetic biology could have enormous civilian applications. Now, of course, at the last minute in 2003, the verification protocol negotiations came to a very abrupt end because of a lot of angry words being exchanged between the US delegation and the Iranian delegation. And as a result, the conference was put into abeyance and it has never been resumed. So that is why, for example, the Biological Weapons Convention today does not have any verification provisions. But, but the point of this thing is that there is a very close interface, because as we start dealing with dual use technologies, the notion or the manner in which we start looking at security issues has to get modified. And the whole notion of arms control undergoes a transformation. See, the old treaties, the way they were concluded, were largely a product of Cold War, because along with when the UN came into being in 1945, and by 1949, NATO had also come into existence. So, in a sense, the US Soviet divide got formalized. So, all this arms control that we saw took place in a bipolar context, in the context of two nuclear superpowers, as it were. And their objective was all, and these technologies were under state control. So today, when you are looking at these technologies, you are looking at normative approaches, you are looking at codes of conduct and things like that, which is a very different way from simple arms control negotiations, which are led by states and governments, to what we are today increasingly calling the multi-stakeholder approach. You know, I mean, that is why, if you notice, you have ongoing discussions on things like internet. I mean, how do we still don't know. I mean, we keep having these conferences about managing the internet, but it's extremely difficult because these have become technologies that have become which have such a huge role in the private sector, that the private sector has become the leading technology developer in so many of these areas, and it is no longer the preserve of governments. So security has shifted from the idea of either seeking dominance or preventing the other chap from gaining dominance to something like a mutual security, to something like a sustainable security that enables civilian activity to continue, in fact, to grow, because that has so much of economic implication, and yet at the same time is not misused. I mean, you take space for that matter. I mean, just look at the application. I mean, look at the whole thing of weather, communications, mobile telephony, navigation, GPS. I mean, remote sensing, things like these ride hailing apps like Uber and Lyft. I mean, all of this depends on satellites that are dedicated to civilian applications and make use of the space technologies. And yet, if you think about it, GPS was not developed by civilians. So many of these foundational technologies got developed as defense related technologies. And that is one of the challenges of the search for sustainable security in today's world. Because in today's world, also, you are no longer looking at a bipolar world. I mean, it is no longer just two countries that are going to call the shots. There are many more players. So it's a multiplayer in terms of countries. There are more countries that are involved. And in terms of entities, it is no longer just government entities. I mean, we ourselves are talking about having a space law that can permit the growth, development, and growth of our new space entities. That is how you and I, in fact, have got to know each other, and from the paper that I have written promoting the idea of legislation that could regulate the growth of our space industry, because it has so much potential for our socio-economic transformation, which is an absolute key for India's development. But the point is, then, how do we ensure that when this technology gets diffused, then how do we ensure that the same sense of protection, or ensure that wrongful application does not take place, because even inadvertently, because very often it is inadvertent. And that was actually how some of these controls came into being. Now that we have these controls, initially, I can tell you, when we were trying to talk about these controls, my colleagues in Department of Space and Department of Atomic Energy, they used to get very upset. They used to tell me, why are you recommending this? This is our indigenously developed technology. We will give it to whoever we like. So I would say, hang on, yes, you do that. I'm not saying you don't. But all I'm saying is that you better be careful that you know the background, because, where I was sitting in the Ministry of External Affairs, I was quite aware of how false fronts were being set up. I had followed the Pakistan's clandestine nuclear program very closely. I had also seen the use of chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq war. And I saw how the Iraqis actually, by talking about, were importing certain dual-use chemicals from India by claiming that they were meant for fertilizer factories in Iraq, when actually they were being diverted for chemical weapons purposes. Now, While I have no difficulty for Iraq importing chemicals for fertilizers, but when you look at the quantities involved, I mean, you wonder, well, how much fertilizer are they going to use? And so some of these nitrates and so on, and phosphorus-based chemicals were being used actually for making chemical weapons. We don't want to be accused of being irresponsible in terms of today's age of globalization. We don't. We always try to project ourselves as a responsible global citizen. So we wouldn't like to be. So this always, it was a process of actually assuring them that this was not intended to in any way, constrain their technological development or anything like that, but to ensure that they remained in good international standing, which was also something that ISRO scientists or nuclear scientists in atomic energy also valued hugely.
What was interesting then, what you said is this whole art of negotiation between diplomats and countries, and coming to a point where you want to make it a point that there's something to take back for us in this case. So can you provide any like perspective on how a country like US or diplomats from the other side are able to take you into confidence to your word that, for example, there will be no leakage of technology from ISRO to the military or things like that, right? Because at the end of the day, it's all Indian institutions and they have to take your word for it and say that, we're going to trust all of this that you guys are saying. And it's an art possibly just convincing them that they need to take you to your word, and this is what the promise will be. But then there's also a method that they need to have to possibly verify at the same time that this is what is happening on the ground as well. But I guess even the verification comes
Hmm.
after they've trusted and they are following the developments. But even before that you'll have to make a case, and that needs some kind of trust to even get that confidence to take the next step. So how does this really occur in diplomacy?
Well, I mean, one enormous difference between, let us say, a country like the US or a country like India is that in the US, it is very clear that the Department of State is the authority responsible for all external relations. So let us say if Department of Defense or Department of Health Security or Department of Narcotics or Department of Treasury or any department has to engage in any discussion with any foreign country or any international body on a technical issue which is under the purview of that department. It cannot take place without a representative of the State Department being present. Now, actually speaking, we also have a similar rule. The Cabinet Secretary of India has something called the Rules of Allocation of Business. And the rules of allocation of business make the Ministry of External Affairs the agency that is involved with all external relations with all countries as well as with all international organizations, etc., etc. However, given the fact that we perhaps did not develop adequate coordination processes between ministries, so we have had this tendency of working in silos, as it were. And that puts us at a disadvantage in many of the so called technical negotiations. And I say this because, and this means to get over this hurdle, it requires two things. First of all, I have to gain the trust of people in ISRO or in the scientific departments that, look, I am on their side, that we belong to the same team, that I'm only trying to help them. And that is very important. And somewhere there, this is where I think some of my long years of experience of dealing with these issues, and plus maybe the fact that I could understand a lot of the jargon which people were using because of my own science background and my interest in having followed these technological developments was useful. And that helped to bring about an element of trust. Then comes the other issue of then we present ourselves as a team. For example, when we got the NSG waiver, I mean, how was it was the negotiating team. The nuclear dialogue began with the US between Strobe Talbot and Jaswant Singh, the late, who was, and we had almost 18 rounds in 22 months. But it was backed up with technical talks and things like that. So, and from there, as it moved forward, our delegation always had people from the Department of Atomic Energy, whether it was the chairman Atomic Energy or some of his other officers who were also part of it and things like that, who were part of it. Now, because, but then it has to be a team effort, and without that, it would not have worked. Now, we know that, I mean, let's take the late former president of India, Dr. Abdul Kalam. Okay. Everybody knows that he started out with ISRO, right? Everybody knows that he was working on liquid propulsion engines. And everybody knows that he moved to DRDO, where he was working on missiles. It's common knowledge, right? So everybody knew that there was a certain osmosis, there was a certain implicit tech transfer, knowledge transfer, because of scientists moving from one to the other, or scientists even meeting and discussing problems. I mean, if Dr. Kalam in his missile program came across a difficulty that he felt that maybe I should talk to somebody in ISRO who was working on this, because I remember he had this expertise in this particular field, and let's see if he has worked a little bit more and what has he come up with, and whether he has faced a similar problem. He would fix a meeting and go across and meet him, and they would meet as old friends, and over their dosa they would take out a piece of paper and figure out what was going wrong in your calculations or in the other person's calculation. Now, but as you develop, because ISRO has always maintained itself as a civilian organization. So somewhere then you will have to realize that you need to draw lines, because while your missile program is a vital part of your national security interest, if you want ISRO to have an existence as a civilian entity, then ISRO cannot have a foot in both camps. I mean, it cannot be involved with making missiles, because then it will need to have very different set of knowledge controls and export controls and security checks and all of that, which is the way we deal with things in our defense establishment. And so I think this realization that also took a long time in coming about in our scientific establishment, because see, our scientific establishment, because it had gotten cut off in the 70s, and therefore there was a feeling that whatever we have done has been done by purely domestic effort, and therefore nobody else should be able to tell us how to behave or how to control or what to do with our indigenously developed capabilities. But that's not it, because ultimately you are also wanting to gain a certain acceptance, as I mentioned earlier, as a responsible global citizen. So for a diplomat, it is very important, as I said, it has to work in two stages. One is, first I have to gain the trust, and I have to get my own scientific colleagues to believe that they and me, we are on the same team and we have the same objectives. And then, because I can speak the language, and if I don't have the same scientific background, then I must have the patience to learn about it from them. I must develop a degree of empathy to be able to understand their concerns. And they must have the trust that I can now convey their concerns and safeguard their concerns in an appropriate manner when it comes to negotiations outside, whether in the UN or in the MTCR forum or with France or with US or with any other country. Because I also will combine with it the diplomatic jargon. And I would very much like that. And I tried this, but unfortunately, our foreign service is such a small cadre that we have very, very few officers, and that's a whole different issue altogether. That, but I had also managed to get Department of Space at that time, at the time of Dr. Kasturi Rangan, to agree that the idea of having a person from the Ministry of External Affairs posted in Bangalore with the Department of Space to deal with external relations, to act as the interface between Department of Space and Ministry of External Affairs on a regular basis, because this is the only way we will develop the comfort levels needed to work as a team together.
That's very interesting. And the outcome is, do you have a person dealing with in Bangalore from as an MEA representative today, or?
No, unfortunately not. I mean, they, Department of Space, when, Dr. Kasturi Rangan, when he saw how we were negotiating, how we delivered this or that for the Department of Space, I mean, he agreed. Department of Atomic Energy, incidentally, has a person from MEA always located in Bangalore who handles the external relations aspects, and particularly with the IAEA in Vienna also, and so on, and works closely with the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission on these issues. I think that has happened largely. It happened in the 60s largely because of Homi Bhabha's vision, as it were. Somehow or the other, space Department of Space didn't get this, but I do hope that since you have a very loyal following, I hope people are listening, and I hope this is something, because I strongly believe that this is an idea whose time has come, and that is one way. And I think that there is also an interest in in the Ministry of External Affairs, that these issues are not technical issues. Very often, when I was looking after the Disarmament and International Security Affairs Division, and some young fellow, some undersecretary who had joined the Foreign Service, say 5 years ago, and he had come to join this division, and he would come to me, and initially he would be very excited, but then when I asked him to do some work on a particular problem, and then he would come to me and say, "But sir, this is too technical." I mean, I had a very clear answer. I said, "Listen, if this subject is the subject of negotiations with another country, and that is why we are in MEA, right? The negotiations are based on politics. There is no subject that is too technical. I mean, if a country wants a particular product to be put on a control list, they will use a technical argument, but behind that, there is a political purpose. So if you don't understand the technology, you will not be able to understand the politics. So don't come and tell me that, because let us say we would get suggestions. This was during, as I said, the biological weapons verification protocol negotiations. We would get suggestions about putting product A or B or C on a control list, or A should be on a more sensitive list and B should be on a less sensitive list, or whatever it is. And people would say, well, how? Okay, I'm not a biologist, but I must have access to my expert community to ask them, where do we use this? And if this is a proposal that has come from, say, Germany, why does Germany want to tighten the export of this or relax the export of this? And so somebody who's in the technical field can explain to me Germany's commercial interest. Now, if I understand, I don't need to know the formula of the product, but I need to understand that that is why it is the subject of a negotiation, because ultimately it is politics. See, therein lies the difference. So I would say that, therefore, we should get out of this idea, because when we are negotiating, it is always politics. How is it that suddenly we came under the severest of sanctions in 1998 after the nuclear tests? And how is it that we were able to get the only country in the world to have got a waiver, a clean waiver, that without signing the NPT, without giving up our nuclear weapons, we were able to get a waiver to enable us to engage in civilian nuclear cooperation by the nuclear suppliers group, because we changed the political perceptions, right? And we couldn't have done that if we did not have the trust of our scientific community. And it would not have worked if we had not convinced our interlocutors and the people we were negotiating with in terms of bringing about a change of perception in their minds about India, what India stood for, how India could be a partner rather than a potential adversary, and why they should start looking at India differently.
I want to skip to more recent times of what is your assessment of how space has formed a part of the diplomatic negotiations, or all of this neighborhood policy and everything, because I don't know much about diplomacy or anything of the history of diplomacy when it comes to India or so on. But then, from what I've at least we followed in the recent times, only now you see the prime minister directly talking about space as a SARC satellite, or space as a part of the foreign policy with Navik or other such instruments, or even people talking about how the whole Mangalyaan mission was a huge soft power approach to using space as a part of enhancing soft power of India globally and everything. So, in your assessment, is this something that the political establishment in India is now using, or has you tried to mature this as an idea of diplomacy, or has it always been and it's only highlighted now because of the media and the press? Or what is your kind of assessment, or and also what do you see as lost opportunities in using space as a part of diplomacy?
Well, I think what has happened is that as we have developed our capabilities, and as we have intensified our engagements with the rest of the world, we have been more willing to talk about it, and talk about it as something that, after all, today, let's face it, we are one of the handful of countries that have an absolutely impeccable record in terms of satellite fabrication, satellite applications, launch technologies, a range of launch vehicles, tried, tested, cost efficient, and so on. And as civilian interest in space has grown, as I was telling you earlier, the space activity was dominated by governments. During the Cold War, as I mentioned, 93%, and the Cold War was there till 1990, right? It is only in 1991 that the Soviet Union broke up. So, in a sense, that till that time, 93% of all space launches were done by US and USSR, by NASA, which is a government entity, and the Soviet Space Authority. And if you look at 2020, 90% of all satellites that were launched belong to the private sector. I mean, look at the transformation. Well, it is hardly surprising, therefore, that so many entities that are getting into the space sector but don't have launch capabilities. They do a market survey, find out which has a good record, which is financially viable for them, which is cost efficient for them, and then they approach ISRO. Now, and ISRO, I mean, it is only in the 1990s that ISRO set up the Antrix Corporation. And now, of course, we've set up the NewSpace India Limited. And although there again, I think we should be able to give it a little more autonomy, put it a little more at arm's length. We still have too much of uh, the everything under one tent, as it were. But hopefully, we should get that. And as you get that, because that is the only way we will see the growth of our space entrepreneurs. I mean, you had a podcast some time back where I think you were discussing with somebody about why Indian space entrepreneurs find it easier to set up offices or uh, operate from outside. I forget the name of one of who you were talking to, but so why is that? I mean, they felt that the environment here was not as welcoming or as conducive. Now, so I think it is important that we create that conducive environment at home if we want our private sector space capabilities to develop. And that is what I have, in fact, written about, that looking at the potential for this, it is absolutely critical that we are able to harness these enormous applications for which the field is now opening up. I mean, ISRO has done its job, as it were, by providing us with that wherewithal. Now it is the job, because, see, ISRO's capabilities are in that sense limited. After all, ISRO's budget will increase by 10% a year. I mean, it can't increase by 100% year after year after year. But if we are looking at an annual compounded growth rate of 15%, 20% in the space industry, then where is the investment going to come from? And it can only come from the private sector, and it can only come in a more conducive environment, in a more welcoming environment. So I think that what we have to look at is, therefore, just as other foreign companies find it useful to come to ISRO for their launch services or any of the other services, I think we should be able to create an ecosystem where we allow our own capabilities to develop, to leapfrog in a sense, so that we can get much higher rates of growth.
One of the interesting ideas that you talked about, especially this MEA representative, takes me back to potential comparison with China, which is giving out free satellites, free launch slots to other countries, and really combining them, and also integrating this whole space infrastructure into big projects and big topics like this One Belt, One Road initiative and others.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the space dimension is a huge element of the One Belt, One Road. In fact, if you look at it, this is how it comes together. Now, the Prime Minister, let me put it like this. Now, let's say the Prime Minister is planning a speech for a SARC summit. Now, he's not going to write that speech himself. He's going to ask people in the foreign ministry who deal with SARC to say, look, I'm going for the SARC summit, but I want to look at some new areas. So now, if the person in MEA who's dealing with these SARC issues, if he's only going to look at SARC free trade area or SARC water sharing, these are the traditional bread and butter issues, as it were, because we share boundaries, so we have shared water resources, so you do water management. Again, we talk of commercial interest, economic interest, so free trade, we do investment promotion, things like that. But let's say if you have to look beyond, then first of all, you must be aware as to what your own capabilities are, isn't it? And that is how we have now started. I mean, the IT sector, for example, has become a big thing. India as an education hub, as a knowledge hub, has become a big thing. India as a health service provider, health tourism. The number of people, I served in Afghanistan, I was ambassador there, and I remember the number of medical visas we used to issue for Afghans to come and get treated at hospitals in and around Delhi. And in fact, while I was there, you see, because in Afghanistan, the medical infrastructure had been completely destroyed. And so our private hospitals like Apollo, like Escorts, like and others, they used to come there, set up medical camps. So they would bring a doctor or two doctors or something like that, set up a medical camp for 3, 4 days, do certain tests, and where people needed more tests or where people needed other interventions, then they would advise them accordingly, and then those people would come to India, and things like that. Similarly, in the age of telemedicine, I mean, I remember in when I was posted again in Nepal, we set up a telemedicine link with Apollo hospitals and a local Kathmandu based hospital. Now, we can do this provided you are aware of India's capabilities. And that is how projection of India changes. And people speak, in the old days, it was all very well to think of India as the country of Maharajas and the rope trick and the snake charmers. And I mean, but I think that in the 1990s, thanks to the IT, we have changed that. So with the IT boom, with our emergence as a nuclear weapon state, as a major nuclear power, our emergence as a tech power. Now, COVID has shown. I mean, how many people before? I mean, how many people before COVID knew that we were the powerhouse of vaccine production globally? But now everybody knows that some of the largest vaccine producing companies are located in India. Well, again, we have done some pioneering work here. So some of the new developments, particularly on child-related vaccines, the pentavalent vaccine that was developed by Shanta Biotech in Hyderabad, which was subsequently acquired by Sanofi Aventis, a French company, because of the incredible R&D work they had done. So what I'm saying is that unless we ourselves first, the diplomat, so if let us say the person who's doing the SARC speech, if he has some idea, then he will say, well, how this would be something which would be unique because no other SARC country can match an offer like this. And that is how something like this would come up. And that's how the concept of SARC satellite comes in. So I think that we, first of all, as I said, one of the points that I made earlier was that we should get out of the notion of working in silos or thinking in silos because that narrows your vision, and that is what is critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, the opportunity that I also see is, today, like in other sectors, like you said, even in the biotechnology sector or so on, the government is using private sector capacity as a part of its diplomacy initiatives as
Sure,
well, right? And
absolutely.
space as a part of it can take it to that level as well, because at the end of the day today you have so many of these companies who are willing to invest more and do more and scale up to a lot of initiatives. But we are not there yet, as in we're not still knocking on those doors in with respect to space.
Yes, unfortunately, that is, and I think that what we need to have, I think your listeners would know, we had a draft Space Activities Act, which then lapsed when it didn't get taken up, and just as well, perhaps because I always thought that that was somewhat too restrictive, and the kind of act we needed was a more liberal, a more open act, and where the entities would be less tied to the ISRO apron strings, as it were. Whether it is with regard to, although ISRO keeps talking about commercialization of launches and about more and more applications. So we need a satellite communication policy. We need a remote sensing policy because some of the old policies that we've had are 2 decades old. And we need to update those to take into account where we are today. See, the whole investment culture has also changed. 20 years ago or 30 years ago, you didn't have the investment culture of seed funding and seed capital and Series A and venture finance and Series B and, all of this. All of these instruments are a reflection of the new economy that we are talking about. And this, it is essentially the digital economy, and the digital economy is driven. The digital economy essentially could not have happened without large scale computing capabilities and large scale internet speeds, all of which requires space assets. I mean, so there is a seamless link here, which our administrators and people in government need to be able to understand in order to be able to unleash this and open this up, so that it no longer acts as a constraint but actually becomes an enabler.
Right. And one of the things that is very interesting here is there are other things that are not in the control of even ISRO, for example, that stops, let's say, the growth of the private sector, in my opinion, which is topics like procurement rules and the manual for that is set by the government of India when it comes to procurement, and every other institution of the government of India procures around the same manual and the same rules and guidelines. And the inflexibility of that when it comes to technology and technology based procurement is a direct effect on how space or the growth in the space industry can happen. And so, for example, there's a lot of procurement innovation across the world when it comes to space agencies. Space agencies are doing different instruments of public private partnership that does not involve creation of new entities or special purpose vehicles as such, but the entities remain, but the instruments of procurement change by sharing risk and enabling IP creation based on risk and so on. But unfortunately, you look at the procurement manual that Department of Space has to engage with the industry. It's the same old rules that doesn't allow any kind of intellectual property development that involves risk. And there's only one means of a development order that ISRO can provide, which has again a limit on the budget as well as how the IP is created, and involves a lot of red tape again going on all of this. And they can't create any special procurement rules for special technology areas. So for example, if ISRO wants to create an all electric propulsion system, and wants to create it now instead of investing ISRO's own resources, and which would take it 20 years time, there could be a special procurement vehicle or an instrument created that says ISRO wants to procure or develop indigenous technologies in electric propulsion, and we want to be able to select 5 or 6 vendors in India in a way that there's a competition between these vendors alongside ISRO, where ISRO is managing the technology development, overseeing all of this. But then these 5 vendors are competing, and ISRO is supporting them in one form or the other, and there's some investment coming from them and some investment coming from ISRO. But then there's a competition between these players to advance that and to be the first as such. And even if some of them fail, they get the knowledge and they get to absorb that, and they may use it in some other forms in some other projects as such. So these are some of the very new instruments, and this is how the US, the NASA administration is completely transformed procurement in the last 15 years. This is what the Japanese are doing. This is what today the Europeans are doing. But unfortunately, I don't see anybody thinking in India in this sort of a direction as well. And I don't think so. The people at ISRO can take this up as a topic on their own, right? There should be somebody at the federal level thinking about these and saying, how can we give autonomy to these kinds of institutions that are driven by technology, so that they don't go, the gap between them and the developments internationally are not too big, for example.
I fully agree with you. And again, it is completely understandable. You see, the guys who have framed these rules, which are applied with a great sense of uniformity, as it were, whether it is procurement by the Ministry of Education of school books for government schools, or whether it is procurement uh, office cars by for different government offices, or whether it is procurement by ISRO. I mean, it obviously cannot be identical. But then the chap who has prepared these rules, he has tried to do it to ensure that the scope for any malfeasance is reduced. Now, fair enough. That guy does not know or does not understand that the ISRO is a different kind of an entity. And it is, if it is going to be in the business of nurturing technologies and nurturing startups, then it has to have a different approach. But that guy is not necessarily anti-national. I mean, don't look upon him as an adversary. Now, it is for ISRO that if ISRO is genuine about really nurturing startups and letting them go, letting them rise, then ISRO can convince that guy that, look, my requirement is different. See, we have been talking, I've also been engaged with DRDO for a long time and our defense programs, and particularly with regard to technologies and so on. And we've been, as you know, of late, we've been talking about that despite so many years, we are so dependent for all our defense requirements on imports. Why have we not been able to build an indigenous defense industry? Because if defense ministry is going to do procurement in the same fashion, and nobody is interested, I mean, how long, first of all, there is only one buyer, namely the armed services, Ministry of Defense. And suppose there are two guys who are building a tank, and you're going to buy, the Ministry of Defense is going to choose one. So the fellow says, yeah, why should I? Then you won't let me export. Why should I put in that kind of effort into all those things? So clearly, that is why from the first time we introduced our defense procurement policy and started the introduction of the involvement of private sector, which was all nearly 20 years ago, we have had about 10 different iterations of our defense procurement policy. We've introduced offsets, we have taken out offsets. I mean, but other countries have been through this path and we are still struggling. I mean, it's a case in point. Today, we have been assembling aircraft. Hindustan Aeronautics has been assembling aircraft from the days of God knows when. I mean, recently we did 270 plus. We have just assembled more than 270 Sukhoi 30 Mark 1s. After the first were flown in, then we did all the rest in our own facility. And yet, for major servicing, they have to fly back to Russia. And we have not yet been able to design our own aircraft, even for the Tejas, the single engine NCA project, which began way back in the 1980s. The engine is imported. So, I mean, somewhere we have to understand that some of these areas are very different, and a different approach in terms of a different regulatory approach is needed. So it has to be, I mean, you see that in other countries. I mean, how they promote R&D, and they would involve, let us say, both Lockheed and Boeing would be involved in a project to build the next generation aircraft. They would be working on separate areas of technologies, and eventually, yes, one of them would go ahead. But then the funding for the technologies is being provided by the government. And whatever technologies Boeing develops, let's say, out of that, it could have other spin offs. They may not, Boeing may not win that contract. That contract may go to Lockheed, or maybe Boeing wins that contract and the Lockheed may not win that contract. But then in the process, Lockheed has also developed certain technologies which could have other spin offs. So I think you are absolutely right. I mean, we need to modify the procurement rules when it comes to some of these areas. You can't have the one size fits all kind of an approach. You see, but then it's a shared responsibility. If people in ISRO are saying, tell you that, look, oh, these finance guys, they don't listen to us. No, I mean, that's not good enough. It is for ISRO to be able to explain Why their requirements are different? Because it is for ISRO to be able to carry that conviction and say, look, trust me, we have no desire for any malfeasance to take place. We will put in safeguards, but not like this, because this way you are constraining the growth of what we are trying to grow. Find another way. And once you get that communication, then you will find that you can develop appropriate policy instruments.
I mean, all of these seem very large cultural changes in how people approach all of this.
Yes, it is. You know why? Because what has happened is that there has been a kind of concentration of authority, as it were. There is a concentration of authority in the sense that you have one person who heads. Now the Department of Space is part of the government of India, right? So it is headed by the Secretary Space. Now who is the Secretary Space? Chairman ISRO. Who is the head of the Space Commission? The same person. So wherever you look at it, I mean, this is also the model that was followed by the Department of Atomic Energy. Atomic Energy pioneered this model. Bhabha came in, I mean, immediately after independence, and then so you have the Department of Atomic Energy, you have an Atomic Energy Commission. Now, the difference between space, ISRO, and atomic energy. I mean, it was all very well when our programs were small, when it was we were sanctioned, when our international exchanges in these areas were constricted, and so on. However, now there is a difference. Now, atomic energy is the custodian of our nuclear security paraphernalia, namely our nuclear weapons capability. So they design it, they develop it, they store it, and so on. Because, as you know, we keep these in demated condition and all the rest of it. And then at a certain stage, I mean, as depending on the requirement, the delivery system and the payload will get mated. Now, so even with regard to nuclear power, NPCIL is an entity of the government of India, of the Department of Atomic Energy. We cannot have, under law so far, a privately run nuclear power plant. And that is one reason why we have had some difficulties in some of our negotiations. Now, be that as it may, but there is a security element in the nuclear domain. But that is not so with ISRO, right? I mean, ISRO today is not in the security field. So, if ISRO has to have a structure which has to promote private sector, then the time has come where it has to see what should be the best way in which I can do so. I mean, there was a point in time when this consolidation helped in encouraging R&D but then that R&D was entirely within the government. That investment came from within the government. Now, it is not that ISRO did not have private vendors. They did have private vendors, but who were these private vendors? These were large companies like L&T, like Walchand, like Godrej, and so on. Now, these companies took on work for ISRO, but more out of a sense of prestige, not because the work that they were doing for ISRO was contributing in a big way to their balance sheet. I mean, the work that L&T does for ISRO or the work that L&T does for atomic energy is a tiny fraction of their overall turnover. So they do it because out of that they are also citizens of India. So they do it because they are responsible citizens of India. They do it out of a sense of prestige that they are involved in an important national project. That is why somebody like Godrej will do it. But you see, when you're looking at startups whose entire revenue line is based on space activity or that particular area of work, then that requirement changes. They expect a different relationship. And they're not doing it just for prestige, that this is one item, one small element in our balance sheet. And I think that somewhere, if we need to make this transition to new space, I think we need to understand. So it is for you and your colleagues to be able to convince the decision makers at ISRO and so on, and to be able also to assure them that you and they are on the same team.
It's going to be a fun, cultural change that we'll have to see in the next.
Yes, it is. It is a cultural change, but it is needed. And mind you, you will find a much closer parallel in this with the Department of Biotechnology. See, we are one of the few countries that has a separate Department of Biotechnology. How has biotechnology set up its nurturing units, the BIRAC funds and so on and so on? How have they promoted the private sector? I mean, today the biotech sector, if you, I don't know if any of your listeners, but let's say if some of your listeners go to the Genome Valley outside Hyderabad, I mean, just see the way that has been developed. It's a case in point. There is a nurturing element that has been brought in, and it's a very light hand. It is not as if we don't have national labs, but we've been able to. I think the Department of Biotechnology, because it's much younger department, has been able to, and it's a smaller department compared to ISRO. See, when it was set up, it didn't have a monopoly over the R&D and the technical know-how. Whereas in the space sector, what we've had is that there has been kind of the technology and the know-how has been, in a sense, all housed within ISRO.
Right. And the one thing that I wanted you to comment on is this new approach that US has taken, which is very interesting, especially after the Trump administration, where they formed the National Space Council. Because at the end of the day, the US industry was complaining that there was not enough initiative from the government, and the rules, and the NASA administration was very slow with everything and so on. So what they did is, they formed this National Space Council, which is an executive body within the office of the president of the United States, who's overseeing space activities, right? So, and then they have representatives from all of the different parts of the government. They have the almost like our space commission of sorts.
Yes, I mean, in that sense, I would say that the US has done this because people felt that NASA was not getting enough attention from the White House. So, but we don't have that kind of a problem because right from the beginning, the Department of Space has always been located. I mean, the minister it has always been through the Prime Minister's office. And the Space Commission brings together the Cabinet Secretary, the Finance Secretary, and the other important to permit that interministerial. But you see, what happens is that invariably people are so busy. All these gentlemen are so busy with their own things that and they would have little knowledge about space. So how would they would look at it? Oh, I mean, if you don't really know, then you would look at the finance secretary would say, well, no, this year we can't give you a budget increase of 10%. It has to be 6%. I mean, but yes, I can understand that at one level it will come down to numbers, but at another level, it is because there is inadequate appreciation of what is being done and inadequate communication. It is not an absence of top level attention in India because you have the instruments here like the Space Commission and like the fact that it is comes under the Prime Minister's office. But I think the problem here is inadequate appreciation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, where I was interested in this is that, unfortunately, even if you look at the Space Commission and the constitution of the Space Commission, even in India for that matter, there are two things that are missing. One is you don't have any end user represented in that, because you have, whoever the finance person, and you have the MEA person, and you have the defense person, and you have, the national security advisor, whoever out there. But then, there is no end users of space represented there, the Ministry of Agriculture, or the fisheries ministry, or
That can be easily rectified. I am 100% certain. I am 100% certain that if Secretary Space requests the Cabinet Secretary that at the next meeting of the Space Commission, I would request that one special session be called about the with the end users and get the people from agriculture or meteorology or fisheries or whatever to come and talk. I am 100% certain, having spent 38 years in government, that the cabinet secretary will not say no. So this is, you see, what you're talking about, Narayan, is how do you communicate? Who do you get? Because see, if I am going to tell him that I'm doing this, then perhaps that guy will say, well, he is naturally going to talk big about himself and his activities. So you're right. So therefore, instead of me talking about it, let the end user come and say, look, this is how many jobs our department created. This is how we improved our fisheries yield off this coast. This is what we did in terms of advance information about a coming storm or typhoon or something like that. And this is how we saved so many lives and whatever it is. And this is how we did some crop forecasting, or this is how we came to know about a potential locust infestation that was going to come in here, and we took appropriate preventive action. I mean, you're right, absolutely.
Yeah, the thing is, I see merit for creating a end users and industry advisory group, because the problem is that the end users and the industry are left out with a voice in the Space Commission at this point of time, right? Because there is no representation of the industry in the Space Commission anyways.
Hmm.
And perhaps, there is also no reason to have the industry there as a part of policy making. Maybe it's better to isolate end users and the industry and their advice outside of the Space Commission, and creating a special group which delegates, where you end users and the industry can delegate among itself and present its set of recommendations, or its set of use cases, or its set of requirements to the Space Commission. And then the Space Commission can then deliberate on it, because the Space Commission is then completely independent of any bias, right, by the industry or by the end users as such. And then there's an independent voice that is possible for them to say, because at this point of time, the way the Space Commission is set up, you don't have any inputs that are independently coming to the Space Commission that is beyond what the Secretary of the Department of Space or whoever is saying at the end. And the end user interface at the policy making, it is at a much lower level, because ISRO does have these meetings. Yeah.
You're right, but that is because we have, I mean, you see, the Department of Space is like an administrative entity, so the person who's running it is running it as an administrator. ISRO is a scientific entity, and there is a whole different set of the issues involved here. And so that's what I mean. I mean, after all, I mean, the days of Homi Bhabha and Sarabhai, when these were nascent institutions. See, these were very nascent institutions in the 60s and 70s. And at that time, they were small, and today they have become huge. And the world has also changed massively. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the whole notion of startups and financing models has changed completely. I mean, today, which startup goes to a bank for a loan? I mean, you know, and when do they go to a bank for a loan? So, and if you ask somebody who started a factory in 1970 how they started, and ask them how they started, the model is changed completely. So, you are absolutely right. But then, so it is for, So the organizational structures also need to undergo a shift if they have to be responsive to today's demands, the changing demands of today on that particular sector.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, this is also, I think, the reason why, I can possibly compile. I was thinking about this project that I should possibly compile a list of 100 people that I know who are Indian entrepreneurs who are set up abroad, because I can count them almost by my fingertips today because I know a lot of them. And I was, saying that, if I can compile a list of 100 companies which were founded by Indian co-founders who are all outside of India today, and then ask them, what made you set up a company abroad, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I think we should do a survey. I mean, I'm happy to participate with you in that survey, and and I'm sure the results would be very, very educative.
The thing is, I think these are some of the things where, as you said, the problem is actually not capital, or the problem is not really talent pool. The problem is not really infrastructure.
The problem is an absence of a predictable regulatory framework.
And also access to the end user at the end, because even today, for example, even when I was in India, for that matter, the whole notion of access to an end user directly procuring space based, and the other part of all of this is, innovation not only in terms of procurement, in terms of how you structure the procurement. It is about also what you procure and how you procure, because for example, today, if the armed forces want to procure space based services, so let's say I as the Indian Army want to procure change monitoring service. For example, I have this area of interest in the Indian border where even if a rock moves, I want it to be automatically flagged. And today, this is technologically very capable with Indian companies delivering this service to the Indian Army, right? But then nobody in the Indian Army, as far as I can see, or none of these institutions, including NTRO or RAW or whatever IB or whoever it is, are able to write a tender document that procures a service from an Indian space company that says, give us a service that where we can monitor change on the Indian border, right? And you need somebody to step up and say, I know how to write this tender. I know how to write this. I know how to put an RFP for this, because traditionally what happens is, I've seen this over and over and over. First thing that they'll do is they'll say we want this, and then the second thing that they'll do is they'll say we'll do a survey of all the Indian companies, and then they'll say there's nobody providing the service today, so let us go procure it from from foreign vendors, because there's nobody procuring producing that in India today. That doesn't mean that you don't have the elements to be for that thing to be produced in India.
No, no, that's what I mean by a nurturing environment. But you're absolutely right. You need to have a connect with the end user.
Yeah, so these are, the problem is who takes up these topics, because these are such difficult topics to get consensus on and to get people to agree on to change these things, that you need some way of, like getting consensus among people, because this involves it's like getting a license from WPC and DOS, for example, right? The secretary of Department of Telecom is in Delhi and the secretary of DOS is in Bangalore, and if you want to get meetings between two of them and get consensus, you have to go, like, to two different places in the country and get some consensus at the end. And becomes an extremely difficult job when you have to interface with like multiple departments of any government, not just in India, right? So at the end, so these are, very difficult topics that I see that needs to be resolved for any kind of meaningful entrepreneurship to come out of India at the end.
Yeah, but although, I think that we can get over this. After all, we also have set up our own now, a defense space agency now. Okay, they're very limited. They have two subsets that we've set up. One is for imagery, one is for analysis and things like that. NTRO, but again, NTRO also has to understand that. I mean, I have had some interactions with the NTRO when it was getting set up. And but I think they are realizing that if they want to develop, let's say, hacking capabilities, then they have to approach it very differently because I mean, the guys who are going to work for you in that particular thing, who are going to look for zero-day vulnerabilities, who are going to look for software glitches, who are going to look for hacking potentials, I mean, is a whole. They're not interested in the hierarchical thing of undersecretary, deputy secretary, or second lieutenant, lieutenant, captain, major, lieutenant colonel, and the whole thing like that. I mean, they belong to a different working culture. And yes, so if you want to make use of that talent, then you have to change the way you work. And I think people are realizing it even in very sort of tight security related entities like the army, defense services, like the intelligence, like the National Technical Research, NTRO, and so on. It's a question of you're right. I mean, it requires a cultural shift, and we have to make that happen. And we have to keep chipping away at it.
Right. So thank you so much for again, one last final question before I let you go. It's been a long conversation, and thank you so much for spending so much time in debunking a lot of these topics. It's always interesting to learn in these exchanges. So, from your perspective, where do you see everything heading in the next 5 to 10 years? Because everybody is on a short clock. Because all of these companies who have raised money recently, all of these companies that are trying to do things at the moment in this new space fashion in India, everything they're on, they can only last so much because funding will
Yes.
eventually run out and so on. So there's a short clock on all of them, and we've already seen this introduction of the space bill already 2 years ago, and I haven't seen any movement on it or any case after the first draft as such in all of this. And due to COVID, maybe the government has different priorities, and it will take 2 more years for anything of this nature to come up at the political level as well. So the impact of COVID has been there in what the government needs to focus on, and space may not be, or space entrepreneurship may be too small an area for as an entity as big as Government of India to really focus on. So my thoughts are around all of these, and I wanted to learn from you. For example, where do you see this heading, and do you I in my one nook and corner of my mind, I also feel that this may be too slow in India, and that's my kind of honest opinion, that it may be too slow for the government to react on all of this. And there probably will be a wave of these early companies that have come up who will be wiped off because of the lack of fast regulatory changes and access to markets and access to other things that are out there that are needed. And only then there may be one or two companies that may succeed, which may give the case. But then I strongly still believe that the way things are set up today, a lot of these companies, if there are not many strong changes that will come up very soon, they may really not really succeed to the scale that they are fully potential of. So I wanted to hear about you and your views in this direction.
Well, I think you have to have, let us say, you need to get, say, about a dozen people who are at different stages. And many of your partners in your podcast, I think, are all who have successfully been able to tap the market. And I think you need to get them together, and they're at different stages. Somebody has been more successful, Agnikul or so on. Some of these people have been a little more successful. They've been a little more forward, and you need to get them together to say, all right, now this. And I think the key here is going to be the draft space activities bill, because you see, once you get it into place, then regulations will come out from it, under it. And so you need to get that sentiment in it absolutely right. So what you need to do is to get these people take a look at the draft and then set up a group with let us say, one or two people who have had some experience of institutions, government institutions, one or two people with maybe a lawyer or somebody like that who has worked in on some of these fields, in the tech field, for example, and come together with a coordinated thing, and then reach out, reach out within government, reach out into media. I mean, people, many of us have, we have regular columns in newspapers, we do appear on television, things like that. Reach out to industry organizations. I don't know whether you have your own small industry, nascent industry organizer, or but let's say, does FICCI have a space tech unit or CII? If they don't, then maybe reach out to them to then get that message from these dozen, let's say a core dozen that you look at, and get that message out so that the space activities will provide you with the kind of framework that you need. To me, that is the most important thing. Now, once you have that, then it's good, because then at least you have regulations. And regulations can be much more easily amended. The act, the parliamentary act cannot be. That requires a huge effort to amend that then. So, I mean, in a step by step thing, I think for the next year, we say the next 12 months, your thing should be to get the bill through and modified before it comes, because I don't think there is going to be much debate in parliament. I mean, our parliament is not known for debating these things with any great depth.
Right. So again, it'll be, I think, very interesting to follow up in the next few years, and I, hope things to mature and it goes in the right direction, and everybody there can succeed, and we can have a very strong industry coming out at the end. I'm pretty hopeful of that eventually happening, as such, given the amount of talent and every possibility that we have at the end. So again, thank you so much for taking so much of the time. I hope to catch up with you in Delhi whenever possible, and hope to be vaccinated and catch up with you in Delhi anytime.
Thank you, Narayan. It has been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you.